Step forward and face me." Major Grant Rourke's voice cracked across the field like a rifle shot. 300 soldiers freezing where they stood. He was pointing directly at her Captain Madeline Shaw, standing still at the edge of the formation chin level, hands quiet at her sides. The crowd waited for her to flinch, to apologize, to disappear back into the ranks where men like Rourke believed she belonged. Instead, she walked forward, stopped 2 feet from his chest, looked him dead in the eyes and said, "I am facing you, Major. The question is whether you can face what you've become." If you love stories about quiet people who carry more than anyone knows, subscribe to our channel and follow this story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. We want to see how far this story travels. The morning started the way most bad days do, not with fire, but with a man who believed his voice was the same thing as authority. Major Grant Rourke had been planning this moment for 3 days. Not consciously. He would never have admitted that to himself or anyone else. But the planning was there, buried underneath his certainty, his 25 years of service, and the particular way his jaw tightened whenever he spotted Captain Madeline Shaw standing near the intelligence section with her notepad and her silence and her absolute refusal to look impressed by anything he did. Fort Granite sat in the middle of New Mexico's high desert, surrounded by canyons that the summer heat turned into something close to a furnace. The kind of place where the land itself felt like it was testing you. Operation Broken Compass was the biggest training exercise the battalion had run in 3 years. 300 soldiers, full communications, infrastructure convoy operations, and a final phase scenario designed to simulate the complete loss of satellite navigation, radio coordination, and outside support. Rourke had lobbied hard for the exercise. He believed in hard training. He believed that the only thing standing between a soldier and death in the field was the will to keep moving when everything stopped working. Howe was not wrong about that. The problem was everything else. Rourke stepped onto the main training field at 0700 and felt the familiar current move through him when 300 faces turned his direction. He was a physically large man, broad across the chest, built like someone who had spent 25 years making his body into a tool, and he used that size deliberately, the way some men used silence or charm. He moved through space as though he owned it, and most people reflexively agreed. "Listen up," he said, and his voice carried without effort across the field. 300 soldiers snapped into formation. Even the senior NCOs straightened. He walked the line. He always walked the line before a speech. It reminded everyone that he was not behind a podium, he was among them, which he believed made him accessible, though in practice it only made him more intimidating. "Today is the last phase of Broken Compass," he said. "And before we move into the field, I want to say something plain. Technology fails. You know this. Your GPS fails. Your radio fails. Your satellite link gets jammed, hacked, or blown off a tower by a mortar round. And suddenly you are standing in the dark with nothing but your training and the soldier beside you. That is the moment we are preparing for. That is the only moment that matters." He paused. "Let it land. What does not fail," he continued, "is physical courage. What does not fail is the willingness to move forward when every instinct tells you to stop. What does not fail is the man or woman who can take what life throws at them and not blink." It was a good speech. Rourke had given versions of it dozens of times, and it was good because it contained truth. The soldiers felt it. You could see it in the set of their shoulders. And then his eyes found Madeline Shaw. She was standing to the left of the intelligence section, slightly apart from the cluster of analysts and communication specialists, who generally stayed close together the way people do when they share the understanding that they are not the most popular kids at the table. She was 29 years old, blonde, medium height, wearing her uniform with the particular tidiness of someone who dressed by habit rather than performance. She had a notepad in her left hand. Her pen was clipped to the top of it. She was not watching Rourke. She was watching the soldiers scanning the formation with the quiet, systematic attention of someone who was always collecting data. That was the thing about Madeline Shaw that irritated Grant Rourke on a level he could not entirely explain even to himself. She was always watching, always still, always that quiet. In his experience, stillness in a person either meant wisdom or weakness, and he had decided without much actual evidence that hers was the second kind. She had been transferred to Fort Granite 6 weeks earlier. Her record listed signals intelligence field analysis and tactical assessment. She had spent the last 2 years in a position that Rourke privately called a map room, not a combat post, not a forward operating position, but a chair behind a desk, somewhere with air conditioning and satellite feeds and the luxury of thinking before acting. He had decided on the day she arrived that she was the kind of officer the Army was producing too many of, credentialed careful and ultimately useless when the situation required someone who could act. He walked toward her. It was not something he planned in that exact moment, but it also was not something that surprised him when he started moving. It felt like the natural direction of something that had been building for 6 weeks. "Captain Shaw," he said. She turned toward him without hurry. "Major Rourke." 300 soldiers had followed his movement. The formation had not broken, but the attention had shifted. "Come into the circle," he said. She did not move immediately. What circle, sir?" He gestured at the open space in the center of the field, the area that naturally formed when a large group of people organized themselves around a speaker. "Right here, Captain. I want to use you as a teaching example." She looked at the space he indicated, then back at him. "May I ask for what purpose?" "For the purpose of making a point about operational decision-making under pressure," he said. He kept his voice even, but there was something underneath it, a pressure that most people in that formation recognized and knew better than to challenge. Maddie looked at him for a moment. Then she stepped forward. She walked into the center of the field and stood there. And what struck the soldiers who were watching was not that she seemed afraid she did not, but that she seemed entirely unbothered. The way a person looks when they have stood in worse places and already know how this kind of thing goes. Rourke followed her in and turned to face the formation. "Captain Shaw is one of our intelligence officers," he said. "She writes our field assessments. She analyzes our radio traffic. She reads our terrain maps and produces reports that our commanders use to make decisions." He paused. "Can anyone tell me what is missing from that list?" Silence. "Field experience," said a corporal near the back, too eager trying to please. Rourke pointed at him. "Say it louder." "Field experience, sir." Rourke turned back to Maddie. "The captain has been with us for 6 weeks. Before that, she was in an intelligence analysis position. Before that, I am told, another analysis position." He said the word analysis the way some men say paperwork. "So I want to ask the captain a direct question in front of this formation, because I think it is the most important question a soldier can be asked." He stepped closer to her. He was close enough now that most people in the formation would have involuntarily stepped back. Maddie did not step back. "Captain Shaw," he said, "if there is an enemy standing directly in front of you, not in a report, not on a map, but right here in the flesh, what does your intelligence training do for you then?" The field was completely quiet. Even the wind seemed to be waiting, Maddie said calmly and without any hurry. "It tells me what he's likely to do before he does it, sir." A ripple moved through the formation. Not quite laughter, something closer to discomfort, the sound a group of people makes when a situation tilts in an unexpected direction. Rourke's jaw moved. "That sounds like something you'd say in a briefing room." "It's something I'd say in any room where the question is relevant, sir." He turned to the formation. "Does anyone see the problem here? Does anyone see what happens when we produce officers who are more comfortable with analysis than with action?" He turned back to her. "Let me ask you something else, Captain. Have you ever been in a situation where your life depended on physical readiness, not your report, not your assessment, your body and your training?" There was a pause. Not because Maddie needed time to think the soldiers watching her would later say they could see immediately that she already knew exactly what she was going to say, but because she was giving him the courtesy of letting the question finish. "That information is above the clearance level of this formation, sir," she said quietly. It was the precise right answer, and it landed like a blade. Because it meant the answer might be yes, and he had no way to challenge it. Rourke felt something tighten in his chest. He recognized it not just irritation, but something more complicated. The sense that a situation he had arranged was not going the direction he had arranged it to go. "I'll make this simpler," he said. He raised his voice so the whole field could hear him clearly. Captain Shaw, your reports over the last 6 weeks have recommended 3 separate operational modifications to our training exercise. Each of those modifications slowed us down. Each of them created delay. In a real combat scenario, delay costs lives. So when I look at your record, at your training, at the kind of officer you appear to be, what I see is someone who is very good at finding reasons not to move forward. The silence that followed was of a different quality than the one before. This one had weight in it. Maddie looked at him. Her expression had not changed, still calm, still direct, but something in her eyes had shifted. Not anger, not hurt. Something more like recognition. The look of someone who has seen this exact thing before and knows precisely what it is. Major Rourke, she said, and her voice was clear without being loud. The 3 modifications I recommended reduce the probability of signal interference with adjacent training units by 64%, lowered estimated fuel consumption by approximately 12%, and incorporated a weather contingency based on a storm system that your original plan did not account for. The delay those modifications created was 4 hours. The alternative in each case was a more serious problem later. She paused. I understand that 4 hours feels like weakness. I'm asking you to consider that preventing a larger failure is the actual point. Every soldier in that formation heard her. Every one of them understood exactly what she had just done, not attacked him, not retreated, but laid out her reasoning in public with a precision that made his characterization of her work sound like something a person says when they haven't actually read the reports. Rourke's voice dropped. Step forward and face me. The field went absolutely still. He had said it quietly this time, not as a shout, but as something colder and more deliberate. It was an order. The kind a man gives when he wants to make certain that everyone present understands the hierarchy involved. Maddie looked at him, and then she said the thing she said. I am facing you, Major. The question is whether you can face what you've become. The silence that followed was the longest 30 seconds that most of the soldiers in that field had ever experienced. The kind of silence where you become aware of your own breathing. Rourke's face moved through several expressions in rapid succession. Shock, then fury, then something that might have been for just a fraction of a second recognition. Then the fury settled in and closed everything else out. You think that's funny? His voice had gone flat and hard. You think this is a briefing room where you score points with a clever line? No, sir, I don't. Then prove it. He reached out and closed his hand around her wrist, not a strike, but a controlling grip. The beginning of a restraint demonstration, the kind he had used in hundreds of training scenarios to illustrate how quickly a trained combatant could control an untrained one. What happened next took approximately 2 seconds. Maddie's response was not a fighting move in the sense that anyone watching could easily name it. It was more like she simply was no longer where he was trying to hold her. Her weight shifted her arm, rotated in a way that broke the grip without requiring any strength at all. And then Rourke's own momentum. The forward lean he had brought into the grip. The slight overcorrection was suddenly working against him, redirected by a hand at his elbow and a subtle change in her body angle. And then he was on the ground. Not thrown, not slammed, set down, controlled safe and completely horizontal. It happened so gently that it took the formation a moment to process that it had happened at all. Maddie stepped back immediately. She extended her hand to him, open palm up. 300 soldiers stared. Rourke looked up at her from the ground. His face was dark red. He was breathing hard, not from exertion, but from something that had no good name in military vocabulary, the particular experience of being utterly and publicly undone by someone you had decided to humiliate. He looked at her extended hand. He looked at the formation. He looked at her hand again. He pushed himself up on his own and got to his feet. Luck, he said. His voice was barely controlled. That was a trick, a parlor move. Yes, sir, Maddie said. She let her hand drop. Do not mistake a single technique for capability, Captain. I don't, sir, and I'd ask you to extend me the same courtesy. The words were quiet, not triumphant, and that was the thing that unsettled the formation more than anything else. She was not celebrating. She was not looking at the crowd to see how they were reacting. She was looking at him, and the look was not hostile. It was something closer to sad. Rourke opened his mouth. He never got to say what he was going to say, because that was the moment the emergency signal hit. The sound came from 3 different communication terminals, simultaneously, a triple tone that every soldier at Fort Granite knew meant something real had gone wrong. Not an exercise scenario, not a training alert, a real problem. Master Sergeant Noah Briggs appeared from the edge of the formation, moving fast, his face carrying the specific expression of a man who already has the information and doesn't like it. "Major," Briggs said. He looked briefly at Maddie, then back at Rourke. "Training Convoy 7, Red Mesa Canyon. They've gone dark." Rourke pulled himself back into command posture with visible effort. "Navigation failure. Unknown. Last transmission was 4 minutes ago." Briggs held out a radio. 12 soldiers, 3 vehicles. The signal cut mid-sentence. Rourke took the radio. He was already moving toward the command post, already reassembling himself into the officer he was when he wasn't being something worse. The formation began to dissolve into organized movement soldiers, moving to assigned positions, NCOs, calling out instructions, the machinery of response engaging. Maddie didn't move toward the command post immediately. She was looking at the radio frequency Briggs had noted on his clipboard. Looking at the transmission time. Looking at the gap between when the convoy's last scheduled check-in should have occurred and when the transmission had actually come through. Briggs noticed her looking. "Something," he said quietly. She picked up the clipboard and studied the frequency numbers. "The timing is wrong." "Wrong how?" She handed the clipboard back. "Regular radio interference creates a clean cutoff or a degraded signal. This one faded in a pattern." She looked toward the canyon visible in the distance, the red rock formations of Red Mesa rising against the flat sky. "That's not interference. That's a signal being pushed out by a stronger one." Briggs was quiet for a moment. He had been in the Army for 24 years. He had seen things that most people in this battalion had not seen, and he had learned over those years to pay attention to people who looked at a situation with that particular kind of focused quietness. "You're saying someone is jamming them." "I'm saying something is overriding their navigation signal," Maddie said, "which is different and more specific and significantly worse." She paused. "Where is the command post I need to see the full transmission data?" Briggs pointed. And as they walked, he glanced sideways at her at the steady, unhurried way she moved the notepad already open in her hand, the pen moving across it in quick, organized notations, and something stirred at the back of his memory. Something old. Something from a different place and a different time. A pattern of thinking he recognized but couldn't quite name yet. He filed it away and kept moving. Inside the command post, Rourke had already taken control of the table. He had spread the digital map across the screen and was identifying insertion routes into Red Mesa Canyon. His finger tracing the main road that led into the canyon's mouth with the confidence of someone who has already decided on the answer and is working backward. 2 rescue teams, he was saying to the assembled sergeants. Alpha goes in via the main canyon road. Bravo follows as support. We move in 10 minutes. The sergeants were copying it down. Maddie walked to the table. She stood on the opposite side from Rourke and looked at the map. "What is the convoy's last confirmed position?" she asked. Rourke looked up. His expression said several things at once, most of them unpleasant. "The last GPS ping is here." He pointed to a marker approximately 2 kilometers inside the canyon's main entrance. "And the transmission content?" The radio operator, a young specialist who had the look of someone who desperately wanted to be somewhere else, pulled up the recording and played it through the command post speakers. The voice on the recording was clear for 4 seconds, then degraded rapidly. What came through just before the signal died was, "Our map is leading us deeper." Then nothing. The room was quiet. "Our map is leading us deeper," Maddie said. She said it the way someone repeats a sentence to look at it from different angles. Not "we're lost," not "we've hit an obstacle." Their map is doing something active to them. It's leading them. Rourke's eyes found her across the table. "Which means they followed it wrong. Which means their map is showing them something incorrect that they believe is correct, she said. That's a different problem, Major. Their navigation system is malfunctioning. Their navigation system is functioning exactly as it was designed to function, Maddie said, by someone who doesn't want that convoy to come back out of that canyon on its own. The room was absolutely still. Rourke set his hands flat on the table. You are suggesting that someone is intentionally guiding a training convoy into danger during a live exercise. I'm suggesting we need to verify it before we send 2 more teams in using the same digital navigation system. The silence lasted 4 seconds. 4 seconds in which every sergeant in that room was watching Rourke, and Rourke was watching Maddie, and Maddie was watching the map. You're overthinking it, Rourke said. His voice had gone very controlled. You're seeing complexity where there is a simple failure. The convoy's GPS has malfunctioned, they are confused, and they need to be found. That is the mission. Sir, Maddie said. If I'm wrong, you lose 4 minutes running a frequency check before inserting the teams. If you're wrong, you lose 2 more teams in the same trap. The logic was clean and simple, and he knew it. Run your check, he said. He looked at the sergeants. Teams are ready in 10 minutes. We move when I say. It was not a concession. It was him setting a clock on her, a box she was now operating in, small enough that she would still fail. Maddie pulled a chair to the communications terminal and sat down. She looked at the full transmission log, the frequency data, the signal strength readings across the last 48 hours. She pulled up the weather records for the region. She asked the radio operator for the battalion's navigation sync records. He hesitated, glancing at Rourke. Get her what she needs, Rourke said without looking up. The words cost him something, but he said them. The data began coming across the terminal, and Maddie started reading, and the room settled into a working silence. And outside the command post, the training field was alive with the organized movement of soldiers preparing for a rescue, and somewhere inside Red Mesa Canyon, 12 people were following a map that was walking them deeper into the wrong place, and they didn't know it yet. 8 minutes into the frequency analysis, Maddie stopped typing. She went back. She ran the comparison again manually, this time cross-referencing the convoy's last navigation pings against the satellite timing data. She sat back in the chair. There's a second signal, she said. The room, which had been conducting its own business around her, went quiet. Briggs moved to stand beside her. Say again. There is a second GPS signal broadcasting on a frequency adjacent to the battalion's navigation network. She pulled up the comparison on the screen and turned it so the room could see. It's slightly stronger than the primary signal. Any device defaulting to the strongest available signal, which is standard operational behavior for our navigation systems, would have locked onto this one without registering a fault. She looked up at Rourke. Someone duplicated our navigation signal, she said, modified the routing data inside it and broadcast it at higher power so that our equipment would follow it instead of the real one. The convoy isn't lost. They are being guided, specifically, deliberately, and by someone who knew exactly how our systems work. The room did not explode into noise. It did the opposite. The kind of quiet that falls when people understand that the situation they thought they were in is significantly more serious than the situation they are actually in. Rourke stood at the head of the table and did not speak for a long moment. When he did speak, his voice was careful in a way it had not been before. Where is the false signal routing them? Maddie turned back to the screen. She overlaid the false signal's routing pattern against the canyon topography, tracing the path the convoy had been following, extending it forward to where it was likely heading. The signal is pushing them northeast, she said, away from the main canyon road into the secondary wash. She traced the line with her finger. If they keep following it. She stopped. She looked up. What is the storm situation for the region today? Briggs moved to a separate terminal and pulled up the weather data for the surrounding area. He read it. His face did something specific and unpleasant. There's a storm system sitting about 60 miles east of here, he said slowly. It's been stalled since last night. He looked at Maddie. Runoff from a storm that size into the canyon system would hit the dry riverbed at the base of the northeast wash, Maddie finished. She looked at the route the convoy was following. She looked at the secondary wash. She looked at the riverbed. "How long until the runoff arrives if the storm moves?" she said. Briggs checked. He checked twice. "Weather Service is showing a front edge movement starting." He stopped. "It may have already started." "Then we have less time than we think," Maddie said. She turned to Rourke. "Major, we cannot send the rescue teams in using the digital navigation system. They will lock onto the false signal and follow the convoy into the same trap." Rourke looked at her. The room looked at Rourke, and somewhere outside the sky above Fort Granite was clear and dry and gave absolutely no indication of what was happening 60 miles away in the mountain watersheds above Red Mesa Canyon, where the water had been gathering since the previous night. Patient and indifferent, moving the way trouble always does, quietly and all at once. Rourke stared at the routing overlay on the screen for a long moment. His jaw was set. His hands were flat on the table. And every sergeant in that room was doing the particular kind of not looking that soldiers do when they are watching their commanding officer make a decision that is going to matter. "You're certain," he said. "Not a question, a test." "I'm certain the second signal exists," Maddie said. "I'm certain it's routing the convoy northeast. I'm certain that the northeast wash feeds into a dry riverbed that a storm runoff event would reach before any vehicle convoy could reverse out of it." She held his gaze. "What I cannot be certain of yet is whether whoever created that signal intended to harm soldiers, or whether this was a system test that stopped being controlled. But that distinction doesn't change what we need to do right now." Rourke straightened. He looked at the two rescue team leaders standing near the door, Staff Sergeant Carver on the left, Staff Sergeant Okafor on the right, both of them in gear, both of them ready to move. "Teams hold," he said. Carver and Okafor exchanged a glance. Just a fraction of a second. But Rourke caught it and his voice sharpened. "I said hold. Did I stutter, Sergeant?" "No, sir." Carver went still. Rourke turned back to the table. He looked at the screen, then at Maddie, then at the screen again. Something was working behind his eyes, the particular friction of a man who has built his entire career around decisive forward movement, trying to process a situation where forward movement was the wrong answer. "How much time do we have?" he said. "If the storm front is already moving 30 to 40 minutes before the runoff enters the lower canyon system," Maddie said. "Possibly less if the watershed has been saturated from previous rainfall." She paused. "We need to verify the convoy's actual position through non-digital means, and we need to do it fast." "Non-digital means," Rourke repeated. He said it the way a person says something they are not comfortable saying. "Paper maps, terrain reading, physical observation." Maddie had already pulled the regional survey from the bottom of the map stack, an older document printed, rather than generated the kind of map that came from someone who had actually walked the land it described. "And I need access to the full communications log from the last 48 hours, not just the convoy's transmissions, everything." Rourke looked at the radio operator. The young specialist looked back at him. "Sir, the full log is a cleared access document. I need your authorization." The room waited. Rourke said, "Give her access." It was the second time he had said something like that in the last 15 minutes. Both times it had cost him something visible. The sergeants noted it without commenting the way experienced soldiers note everything. Maddie pulled up the full log and began moving through it with the organized speed of someone who knew exactly what pattern she was looking for. Her pen moved across the notepad, not in full sentences in the shorthand of someone used to extracting signal from noise quickly and under pressure. Briggs stood slightly behind her and to the right. He was watching her work with an expression that had been growing more complicated for the last several minutes. He had seen analysts work before. He had seen intelligence officers process data under pressure. And what he was watching now was not that, or not only that. The way her eyes moved across the log, the way she was not reading sequentially, but triangulating, pulling 3 different threads and holding them simultaneously, that was something else. That was a skill that did not come from a desk. I was still turning that over in his mind when she stopped. "Here," she said. She turned the screen toward Rourke. It was a communications entry from 31 hours ago. A routine diagnostic check logged at 0200 when the base was at minimal staffing. The log showed a brief connection to the navigation network's calibration port, a connection that should only have been made during a scheduled maintenance window. Someone accessed the navigation calibration system in the middle of the night, Maddie said. This is where the false signal was installed. Rourke leaned forward and read the entry. Whose access code? Maddie looked at the identifier. It's logged as a routine system check. No personnel name attached. She pulled up the calibration access records. But the access terminal was located in... She stopped. What? Rourke said. Communications Hub 3, she said. Not the main maintenance bay. Hub 3 is a secondary terminal. It's used for field diagnostics. She looked up. Who runs Communications Hub 3? The room looked at each other. It was the young specialist at the radio terminal who answered, and he did it quietly, with the specific discomfort of someone who has just connected something they didn't want to connect. That's Warrant Officer Sloan's section, ma'am. No one said anything for a moment. Rourke turned the name over. Sloan. Calvin Sloan. Yes, sir. Rourke had known Calvin Sloan for 6 years. He was a compact, careful man, 11 years at Fort Granite, reliable to the point that Rourke had long since stopped thinking about him, which Maddie would have said was exactly the kind of reliability that made certain people invisible in the way they chose to be. You're saying Sloan installed a spoofing program in our navigation system, Rourke said. His voice was flat. I'm saying Sloan's section shows the only unauthorized calibration access in the 48 hours before this exercise, Maddie said carefully. I'm not saying anything further than the evidence says. That's a significant accusation. It's a significant observation, she said. The accusation is yours to make, and I'd recommend not making it yet. Not until we've verified the convoy's position and gotten those 12 soldiers out of that canyon. Then we preserve the evidence properly and go through the right channels. If we move on Sloan now before we have everything, and he has access to the communications network. He destroys the records, Briggs said. His voice was quiet and certain. Yes, Maddie said. The room processed this. It was the particular silence of people absorbing the fact that a situation they thought was complicated has just revealed itself to be significantly more so. Rourke stood at the head of the table, and his face was doing something that most of the people in that room had never seen it do. He was uncertain. Not afraid. Grant Rourke was not built for fear in any form he recognized, but genuinely visibly uncertain. And it was worse than fear in a way, because his whole identity was organized around never arriving at this place. What do you need? He said. Maddie looked up from the notepad. She held his gaze for one beat longer than necessary, not to make a point of it, but because she wanted to be sure she had heard the question the way it was intended. I need an old mining survey map that covers the Northeast Canyon system, she said. I need 2 soldiers who can run light and fast on foot. I need the rescue teams re-equipped for non-digital navigation. And I need whoever is watching Sloan's section to keep watching it without making it obvious. She paused. And I need you to trust me for the next 30 minutes. Rourke looked at her. His expression had the quality of a man doing something that doesn't come naturally and doing it anyway. Get her the survey map, he said to Briggs. And get Carver and Okafor in here. He looked at Maddie. You have 30 minutes. He said it like a hard limit, like he was setting the boundary of a thing he was permitting rather than supporting. But Maddie didn't need him to feel good about it. She needed him to hold still long enough for her to work. She was already working. The mining survey arrived in Briggs's hands 4 minutes later, a physical document aged and slightly brittle at the folds pulled from the base's historical records section by a private who had sprinted both ways. Maddie spread it on the table next to the digital map and began comparing them, her finger tracing features on the old document that matched the terrain she had memorized from the digital version. The Northeast Wash has a secondary access point, she said. It's not on the digital map because it was blocked by a rock slide in the 1980s. But this survey shows the original mining road that went through it. She traced it. If that road is still passable on foot, even partially, it gives us a route into the canyon that doesn't follow the main entrance where the spoofed signal is strongest. Briggs studied the route. That's a hard approach. The terrain. I know, she said. Do you know this area? Some of it. What about here? She pointed to a spot on the survey. This ridge. Is it accessible? Briggs was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that surprised the people around him. "I've been up there once, about 4 years ago. There was a training incident near the secondary wash. Soldier got disoriented. We went looking." He studied the map. "The road is rough but passable, on foot. Definitely not by vehicle." Maddie nodded. She made a notation. "Then that's our approach." "Our approach," Briggs said. "I'm going in with the recovery team," she said. She was saying it as a fact, not a request. Briggs glanced toward Rourke, who was across the room talking to Carver and Okafor in a low, controlled voice. Then he looked back at Maddie. And then he did the thing that most senior NCOs do when they have decided they trust someone. He stopped asking questions and started solving problems. "I'll get you the right gear," he said. Rourke came back to the table. He looked at the route Maddie had marked. "You're recommending a foot approach through the secondary mining road." "Yes. That adds time. It removes the risk of the rescue team being spoofed into the same position as the convoy," she said. "And it gives us a route the false signal can't predict because it doesn't appear on any digital map." He looked at the route. He looked at her. "The teams go in without digital navigation. Paper maps, compass bearings, and timed movement," she said. "They know how to do it. Every soldier in this battalion trained on land navigation before GPS was standard." Rourke said nothing. He was doing the math. Not the arithmetic of routes and distances. He had done that in 3 seconds. But the other kind of math, the harder kind where you weigh what you know against what you were wrong about and decide what to do with the remainder. "Set it up," he said. In the next 8 minutes, the command post reorganized entirely. Carver's team stripped their digital navigation devices and received paper map packets, compasses, and a timed movement schedule. Okafor's team was tasked with establishing a communications relay using physical light signals and voice runners. The digital rescue insertion was canceled. The whole plan shifted, and somewhere in the base in communications hub. 3. A man named Calvin Sloan was either watching all of this happen or he wasn't, and neither possibility was comfortable. Maddie had a young communications specialist. A specialist named Tyler Boone, running a quiet trace on the calibration access terminal in Hub 3. Tyler was 22 years old and had the particular energy of someone who has recently done something they regret and is trying not to show it. He'd been assigned to the communications section 3 months ago, fresh out of training, enthusiastic, in the way that young soldiers are before the job teaches them what enthusiasm costs. She found him at a secondary terminal, near the edge of the command post, trying to look busy with a task that clearly wasn't keeping his attention. His eyes kept going to the door. His hands were not quite steady. Maddie sat down across from him. He looked up, and his face did the thing faces do when someone has been expecting a confrontation, and the confrontation has just arrived. "Ma'am?" "Tyler," she said. He blinked. She had used his first name. Nobody at that rank used your first name unless they were either very good at their job or very good at making you trust them. He wasn't sure which this was, but the effect was the same. "I need you to tell me something," she said, "and I need you to tell me the truth, not the version you've been working on in your head for the last 2 hours. He stared at her. "Yesterday evening," she said, "between 2100 and 2300, someone used an unregistered diagnostic device to access the battalion's communications network. The access point was Hub 3. The device's connection signature is in the calibration log, but whoever set it up scrubbed the access record afterward. Mostly." She paused. "They didn't scrub the power draw timestamp." Tyler's face had gone very still. "The power draw." Maddie continued, keeping her voice even and entirely without threat. "Shows a connection from a device registered to." She looked down at the notepad, though she already knew what it said. "A personal laptop. The model number corresponds to a consumer-grade diagnostic unit that one of the specialists in communications section purchased 14 months ago on a personal account." She looked up. "That specialist is you." The silence lasted 5 seconds, which was enough. "I didn't know," Tyler said. His voice had the particular quality of truth, not polished, not rehearsed, not organized around self-protection. Just the raw material. "I swear to God, ma'am, I did not know what it was going to do." "Tell me what happened," she said. He took a breath. Warrant Officer Sloan asked me to connect my diagnostic unit to the Hub 3 calibration terminal. He said it was a routine compatibility check before the exercise. He said the system maintenance team was behind schedule and he needed the diagnostic data before morning. He stopped. He's been my section supervisor for 8 months. He's never given me a reason to... He stopped again. I connected it. I left it running. I went to sleep. When did you disconnect it? About 0400. Sloan said the check was done and I could pull it. Maddie looked at him. She looked at him the way someone looks at a person. They are making a decision about not whether to trust them, but how to use what they have to offer. You didn't do anything wrong that you understood to be wrong, she said. You did something careless that someone else designed you to do. Tyler looked at her like she had said something in a language he recognized but hadn't expected to hear. Ma'am, I violated the protocol for unregistered devices on the network. That's a technical rule violation, she said. Yes, and you will answer for it through the right process. But right now, I need your help with something more important. She held his gaze. Your device ran connected to the calibration terminal for approximately 7 hours. It would have logged every operation it performed. That log is on your laptop. Tyler understood exactly what she was asking. His face went through several things quickly, the fear, the calculation, the choice. If I pull that log, he said slowly, it proves I was connected. It's evidence against me. It's also evidence of what Sloan used your connection to do, she said, which is much more serious than anything you did. He's a warrant officer. I'm a specialist. If this comes down to... It won't, Maddie said. Not if we do this right. Not if we preserve the evidence properly before anyone has a chance to interfere with it. She looked at him steadily. I need you to get me that log. And I need you to trust me when I tell you that doing the right thing now, even when it's frightening, is the only way this ends with you intact. Tyler looked at her for a long moment. He was 22 years old, and he was scared, and he was trying to figure out whether this quiet captain across from him was someone who would protect him, or someone who would use him up and move on. Something in her face settled it for him. Okay, he said. Yeah, okay. Go get your laptop, she said. Bring it directly to me. Don't go through the hub. Don't tell anyone what you're doing. He was on his feet before she finished the sentence. Maddie stood and walked back to the main table where Rourke was going over the movement timeline with Carver and Briggs. The wall clock read 17 minutes since Rourke had given her 30. She had 13 minutes left. She looked at the convoy route again. She looked at the storm data Briggs had pulled. And she did something that the room noticed, though nobody could have explained exactly why it was notable. She went very still. Not hesitant, not calculating. Still the way water goes still before something moves through it. The convoy is already past the fork, she said. Briggs looked up from the movement chart. How do you know? Because the false signals routing has a logic to it. She traced it on the paper map. It's not just pushing them northeast. It's keeping them on routes wide enough for the vehicles. It knows the canyon. It's routing them where the vehicles can still move. She looked at the survey. But the fork at the 3-kilometer mark, the road narrows there. If they followed the false signal past that point, they are now on a road they cannot reverse out of quickly with 3 vehicles. Rourke had stopped talking to Carver. He was listening. They're trapped, he said. It wasn't a question. Not yet, she said. But they will be when the water comes. She looked at him. We need to move now. And then, because the universe has no sense of theatrical timing, but humans always find it anyway. Briggs's radio crackled. A patchy, broken signal barely holding together across the distance and the canyon walls, but enough to carry the voice of a sergeant named DeLuca, convoy lead for Training Convoy 7, who said 6 words before the signal died again. We hear something. The canyon is gone. The room was quiet for 1 beat. Rourke looked at Maddie. She looked at him. And for the first time since the morning, the thing between them was not competition or hostility or the grinding friction of 2 people who have decided not to trust each other. It was simpler than that. It was the basic stripped-down reality of 12 people in a canyon and water coming and not enough time. Carver, Rourke said. Move. Carver was out the door. "Okafor," Rourke said. "Set up the relay." Okafor followed. Rourke looked at Maddie. "You're going in?" "Yes." "I'm going with you." She held his gaze. In another context, this would have been the moment to argue, to point out that a major leading a small tactical entry was not standard procedure, that his rank didn't translate directly into the kind of quiet adaptive movement the mining road approach required. But she looked at him, and she saw something she had not expected to see. He wasn't offering to come so he could take over. He was offering to come because he knew somewhere in the part of himself that had not been corroded by 25 years of needing to be the loudest thing in the room that this was where he needed to be. "Stay close and move when I move," she said. "If I stop, you stop. If I change direction, you change direction. No radio unless I say." He nodded. Just once. She had not expected the nod to feel like what it felt like. Not victory. Something quieter than that. The specific satisfaction of a problem beginning to be solved. She picked up the mining survey, folded it to the relevant section, and put it in her jacket. She checked the compass Briggs had left on the table. She turned toward the door. Behind her, Rourke said, "Shaw." She stopped. "How do you know the foot approach through the mining road will work?" he said. "You've never been in that canyon." She turned back. She looked at him. And then she said something that he didn't fully understand yet, though he would later. "I've been in worse ones," she said, "with worse odds and less time. The variables change. The work doesn't." She walked out. Rourke stood in the command post for 3 seconds after she left. Briggs was watching him from across the table, and Briggs's face had that quality of very careful neutrality. The specific blankness of a man who knows more than he is saying and has decided this is not the moment to say it. "She's done this before," Rourke said. "It wasn't really directed at anyone," Briggs said very quietly. "Yes, sir. I believe she has." Rourke picked up his gear and went after her. At the communications terminal, Tyler Boone came back with his laptop held against his chest, like something he was either protecting or confessing to, and sat down at the terminal. Maddie had indicated, and opened the diagnostic log, and started doing the thing she'd asked him to do, and what came up on the screen, as the log populated line by line, was not a compatibility check, was not routine maintenance data, was a systematic methodical record of a program being uploaded to a military navigation network through an access point that nobody should have been able to use. Tyler stared at the screen. His hands had stopped shaking. Something had replaced the fear, not courage exactly, but the specific steadiness that comes when you stop being afraid of the wrong thing. He started copying the files. Outside the sky, above Fort Granite, was still clear and blue, and utterly indifferent, and 60 miles away, the water was moving, and somewhere in the red rock throat of Red Mesa Canyon, a sergeant named DeLuca had just heard a sound he couldn't place. A low, distant roar that was coming from somewhere above and behind him, steady and growing. That didn't sound like anything that belonged in a desert canyon on a clear summer morning. He put his hand on the radio. The radio running on the battalion's digital navigation network was currently doing what every device locked onto the false signal was doing. It wasn't helping him. It was making everything worse. Sergeant DeLuca pressed the radio to his ear and heard nothing useful. The static was thick and raw. Not the clean, dead silence of a lost signal, but something active underneath it. A texture that a man with enough field time learned to recognize as interference rather than absence. He had 9 years of field time. He recognized it. "Anyone copy?" he said into the handset. "This is Convoy 7 Actual. We have stopped. We need a position verification. Does anyone copy?" The static answered him with nothing he could use. He lowered the radio and looked at the 3 vehicles spread across the narrow canyon road behind him. 2 cargo trucks and a light utility vehicle stopped in a space barely wide enough for the lead truck to turn its wheels without scraping rock. The soldiers had climbed down from the trucks when the road started narrowing. 11 of them standing in the canyon, with the look of people who have just realized that the situation they are in is not the situation they were briefed on. Private Osei had his ankle wrapped in a bandage improvised from a jacket. He'd turned it hard when the truck lurched over a rock shelf 20 minutes back. He wasn't complaining. He wasn't going to complain. But he was sitting on the running board of the utility vehicle, with his boot unlaced and his face carrying the controlled expression of someone managing pain that is actively competing for his attention. DeLuca looked at the canyon walls rising on both sides. He looked at the road ahead, which the navigation system was still insisting was the correct route. He looked at the navigation screen, which showed them less than a kilometer from their intended endpoint, which made no physical sense, given how narrow this passage had become. He looked at his watch. He had been looking at his watch with increasing frequency for the last 40 minutes, and what the watch kept telling him was that they were behind schedule in a situation that was getting less comfortable by the increment. "Martinez," he said. A corporal appeared at his shoulder. "Sarge, tell me what you hear." Martinez tilted her head and listened. She was 24 years old and had sharp instincts, and she heard it before she could name it. A low, resonant sound from somewhere in the canyon system above and behind them. Not rocks, not wind. Something with mass behind it and distance in front of it. "I don't know what that is," she said. "Neither do I," DeLuca said. "And that bothers me considerably." He keyed the radio again. "Any station this net, this is Convoy 7. Emergency position request. We are stopped on the northeast access road at approximately 3 kilometers interior. Navigation system may be compromised. Request immediate voice contact." The static didn't change. DeLuca looked at the road forward. He looked at the road behind, which was too narrow to reverse 3 vehicles out of quickly, even if they started now. He looked at the 12 soldiers depending on him to make the right call in the next 60 seconds. He keyed the radio one more time and said the only thing left to say: "Our map is leading us deeper." Then he said to Martinez, "Get everybody out of the vehicles. We're moving on foot." Martinez's eyebrows went up. "The vehicles. We'll still be here when we come back for them, or they won't," he said. "The vehicles are replaceable. Move." She moved. Maddie heard none of that. She was already inside the mining road approach, moving through the narrow passage in the canyon wall that the 100-year-old survey had described, and that turned out to be exactly where the survey said it would be, which was the thing about old paper maps made by people who had actually walked the land. They were right about the things they recorded, because the person who made the error got lost. She moved quickly. Rourke moved behind her, and whatever else could be said about Grant Rourke, he moved well in tight terrain. 25 years of physical conditioning meant his body knew what to do, even when his mind was occupied with other things, and his mind right now was occupied with several things simultaneously. How was watching her move? He had been watching her move since they entered the mining road, and what he was processing quietly, and without quite knowing what to do with it, was that she moved like someone who had done this before. Not training range done this before. Not exercise scenario done this before. The specific economy of someone who had learned to conserve exactly what mattered in conditions where spending more than you had was the last mistake you ever made. Behind them, Briggs and 2 soldiers named Vasquez and Park kept pace in single file, all of them carrying the same thing. Nothing digital, nothing that would lock onto a signal and follow it somewhere they didn't choose to go. "How far?" Rourke said, keeping his voice at a level that didn't carry beyond the immediate group. "Survey puts the junction at approximately 800 meters from the entrance," Maddie said without slowing. "We're at roughly 400. And the convoy? If DeLuca is half the field sergeant, his record suggests he's already stopped the vehicles," she said. "The question is whether he's moved his people to high ground." "Why high ground?" She said it plainly without drama. "Because that sound you can hear right now, if you listen past the wind, is water moving through a watershed at volume. And it's getting closer." Rourke stopped walking. He listened. He heard it. Low. Steady. Growing in the way that things grow when the distance between you and them is narrowing, rather than the thing itself changing. He started moving again faster. "Maddie," he said, and the use of her first name surprised both of them. He hadn't intended it. It had simply come out, pushed forward by the urgency that was now pressing against everything. "How long?" 20 minutes, she said. "Maybe less." She paused. "Move faster." He did. Back at the command post, Colonel Rebecca Vaughn had arrived. She had been briefed in transit, Briggs had sent a runner with a written summary because the radio situation was compromised, and he trusted paper more than signal at this point, and she walked into the command post with the look of a woman who has received information she wishes she could undo, knowing and understands that wishing is not a relevant response. She stood at the main table and looked at the digital map. Then at the paper survey Maddie had left. Then at the communications log open on the terminal screen. She read it with the focused attention of someone who spent 30 years learning to extract maximum information from minimum time. Then she turned to the sergeant running the command post in Rourke and Maddie's absence. "Where is Warrant Officer Sloan?" she said. The sergeant, a compact, precise woman named Ferreira, said, "Hub 3, ma'am. He reported in at 0800 for the exercise support rotation. He's been there since." "Is he monitoring our communications?" "He has legitimate access to monitor all communications during an exercise, ma'am. It's within his role." "Yes," Vaughn said. "It is." She looked at the screen for another moment. "Get me someone watching his section who looks like they're doing something else. I want to know if he accesses the calibration terminal, the evidence log, or any external network connection." "Yes, ma'am." Quietly, she added. "Yes, ma'am." Vaughn looked at the clock. She looked at the storm data on the secondary screen. She looked at the communications log entry that Maddie had flagged the middle-of-the-night calibration access that was the linchpin of everything. And then she did what commanders do when the situation has moved past the point where preventing the problem was an option. She started organizing what came after. She picked up the phone and called the base legal officer. Ferreira noticed this and did not comment on it. 23 years in the Army had taught her when to notice things out loud and when to notice them quietly, and this was emphatically a quiet noticing moment. At the communications terminal, Tyler Boone had the log copied to 3 separate drives and was in the process of encrypting each one when a voice came from directly behind him. "Working late, Boone." He went very still. He did not turn around immediately because he needed the 2 seconds it took him to not turn around to get his face in order. He was 22 years old, and he was frightened, and Warrant Officer Sloan had a voice that Sloan had clearly learned to use the way certain men use height as a physical fact that reorganizes a room. Tyler turned around. Sloan was standing 6 feet away. He was a compact man, mid-40s, with a face that had learned to be pleasant and stayed pleasant, even when the eyes behind it were doing something entirely different. He was looking at Tyler's screen with the particular attention of someone who knows exactly what they're looking at and is deciding how to respond to it. "Just running some data backups, sir," Tyler said. His voice came out more level than he expected. "Data backups," Sloan repeated, "during a live exercise." "System protocol, sir. Captain Shaw requested redundancy in the communications log during the exercise scenario." He had not planned that sentence. It came out of the same instinctive place that had kept him breathing during the previous 2 minutes, and it worked because it was close enough to true that the part that wasn't true was hard to locate quickly. Sloan's eyes moved to the 3 drives on the desk beside Tyler's laptop. 3 backups. "Standard redundancy protocol, sir." Captain Shaw was specific. A silence that lasted approximately 4 seconds, during which Tyler discovered things about himself that 22 years of living had not previously revealed. Then Sloan smiled. It was a practiced smile, the kind that had been calibrated to look reassuring. "Good initiative, specialist. Keep it up." He walked away. Tyler did not move until Sloan's footsteps had gone past the corner. Then he picked up all 3 drives, put 2 in his left boot, and took the 3rd directly to where Sergeant Ferreira was standing by the command post door. "Ma'am," he said, his voice still level, which was remarkable. "Captain Shaw asked me to deliver this to the command post for secure logging." Ferreira looked at him. She looked at the drive. She took it. "Does the CO know about this?" "I believe she will shortly, ma'am." Ferreira put the drive in her breast pocket and turned back to her post without further comment. Tyler went back to his terminal and spent the next 3 minutes appearing to do routine work while his heart rate gradually descended from something close to dangerous back toward the vicinity of normal. Inside Red Mesa Canyon, the situation had clarified in the particular way that dangerous situations clarify when time runs out, Everything unnecessary fell away, and what was left was simple and immediate and real. Maddie came through the mining road junction at the 400-meter mark and heard the voices before she saw the soldiers. DeLuca had done exactly what she had hoped he would do. He'd moved his people to the higher shelf of rock above the canyon floor. 11 soldiers and 1 hobbling private, arranged along a narrow ledge with their backs to the canyon wall and their faces toward the road below, waiting. "Contact," one of the soldiers on the ledge called out, and weapons came up before the identification registered. "Army Fort Granite Recovery Team," Briggs called from behind Maddie, and the weapons went down, and DeLuca came down the ledge with the controlled urgency of a man who has been doing everything right in a bad situation and is extremely relieved to see someone he can hand the problem to. "Captain," he said, reaching Maddie. Then he registered Rourke behind her, and his posture sharpened. "Major, sir." "Status," Maddie said before Rourke could speak. DeLuca looked at her, then at Rourke, and read something in the fact that Rourke had not corrected her or stepped forward. He answered her. 12 personnel. 1 injury, Osei right ankle probable sprain. Vehicles are on the road below, can't move them, roads too narrow to reverse. Navigation system is showing us on the correct route. I didn't believe it." He glanced down. "That sound is real, and it's coming," Maddie said. "We have a route out through the mining road, but we have to move now. Can Osei walk? With support?" "He'll have it." She turned. "Vasquez, Park, you're with Osei. Sergeant DeLuca, your people move in front, single file, follow Briggs. Fast as you can, keep together." She turned to Rourke. "Major." "Behind you," he said. The group moved. 14 people now instead of 5, folded together into a single fast-moving line, the mining road ahead of them, and the sound from the upper canyon growing behind them in steady increments that no one in that line needed to be told about, because every human body in that situation knows instinctively that the sound of moving water at volume is a sound that belongs in front of you, not behind. Osei moved between Vasquez and Park with his jaw set and his eyes forward. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The ankle was bad, and he was moving anyway, and that was the whole story. They were 300 meters from the junction when Rourke heard it change. The sound from behind them had been growing in a way that was alarming, but still distant. It changed register, not louder exactly, but denser, closer, in a way that was different from the gradual increase of before. The kind of change that happens when water that has been moving through a narrow passage suddenly enters a wider one and expands. "Faster," Rourke said. He didn't frame it as an order. He said it the way a man says something when he is genuinely afraid, which for Grant Rourke was so rare an event that it came out sounding almost ordinary. Maddie heard the register change at the same moment. She said nothing. She moved faster, and the line moved with her. They were not all at once. They didn't see it happen. They were facing the other direction, but the sound of it was unmistakable. A heavy surging crash, and then the sustained rush of water, moving through the space they had been standing in 4 minutes ago. The vehicles they had left on the road below the navigation screens still showing the correct route in their wrongness. The careful engineered trap of the false signal. All of it swallowed in seconds by the runoff from a storm 60 miles away that had been building in the watershed since the previous night, patient and enormous and utterly indifferent to the plans of men. DeLuca heard it and looked back over his shoulder, and his face did something that most people's faces do in that moment, went through the arithmetic of how close that had been, and arrived at a number that was too small for comfort. "Don't stop," Maddie said without looking back. Nobody stopped. They came through the mining road junction, 60 seconds later, into the broader passage beyond, and the sound behind them was enormous, now filling the canyon. But they were above the flood channel, and the road ahead was clear and rising, and Maddie stopped and counted faces as they came through. 14. All 14. She counted twice. Old habit or instinct, or the same thing under different names. Rourke stopped beside her. He was breathing hard. She was breathing hard. Briggs was behind them with his hands on his knees for exactly 3 seconds before he straightened. DeLuca came last, making sure his people were all through before he stepped out of the narrow passage, and when he came through and saw the full group assembled and the opening of the larger canyon ahead, he exhaled a breath that had been compressed in his chest for the last 7 minutes. "Everybody check in," Maddie said. The check-in went around the group. 14 voices, some of them shaking, some of them not quite believing what they had just heard from 20 feet behind them. All of them present. Then Osei, sitting on a rock with his ankle stretched out, said something that broke 6 seconds of tight silence. "Ma'am, I just want to say with all due respect that I will never again trust a GPS unit." Laughter came out of the group. Not the polished, appropriate kind, but the kind that happens when the body releases something. It was holding at high pressure, the ragged, real laughter of people who have just been profoundly relieved to be alive. Maddie let it run for 3 seconds. Then, "Let's get moving. We have a long walk back, and I want everyone at the command post before anyone asks any questions." They moved. Rourke walked beside Maddie as the group moved up the wider canyon passage toward the base. He had not spoken since the junction. She was giving him space to not speak, which she understood he needed. At approximately the 200-meter mark, he said without preamble, "How did you know the mining road was passable?" "The survey showed the original drainage pattern," she said. "If the road had collapsed in the decades since the rockslide, the drainage line would have shifted. The current terrain maps show the drainage in the same position as the survey. The road is structurally consistent." A pause. "I would never have checked the drainage line," he said. "No," she agreed. "You would have pushed the rescue teams in through the main entrance, followed the signal, because your digital systems told you it was correct, and had 2 additional teams in the flood zone." She kept her voice factual, not cruel, just accurate. He was quiet for a moment. "You knew all of that before you brought it to the table?" "Yes." "And you still waited for me to give authorization?" She looked at him sidelong. "It's your command, and the point wasn't to go around you. The point was to get you to the right decision before the time ran out." "What if I hadn't gotten there?" "I would have gone over you to Colonel Vaughn," she said. "And I would have done it without apology because 12 lives are more important than your comfort with being challenged." She paused. "But I believed you would get there." He looked at her. "Why?" "Because underneath of the performance," she said, "you are actually trying to protect your soldiers. You've just been doing it wrong." The words landed without cushioning. She had not offered them gently, but she had not offered them with contempt either. And the combination, the directness without the cruelty, was harder to dismiss than either hostility or comfort would have been. Rourke walked, said nothing for a while. Then from behind them, Briggs said quietly, "Sir, can I say something?" Rourke glanced back. "Sergeant." Briggs had been waiting for the right moment since the command post, since the mining road, since the moment he'd watched Maddie move through the canyon with the particular economy of someone who had done this in conditions that would not have permitted error. He had been turning a memory over for the last hour. A memory from 4 years ago. A different base, a different country. A situation that had no official name in any document he had access to. "About 7 years ago," Briggs said, "I was attached as an observer to a classified recovery unit working a coordination failure in a mountain region. Communication compromised navigation spoofed small team in a narrow passage with water coming." He paused. "The officer running the recovery used a terrain survey technique I had not seen before. Cross-referenced historical drainage patterns against current topographic data to find a secondary exit route." He stopped. Rourke had slowed slightly. "I never got a name," Briggs said. "The unit was classified. The officer was—" He stopped. Then carefully. The officer was a young woman. Blonde, quiet, moved like she had done it before. The silence that followed was of a particular quality. Rourke stopped walking entirely. He turned and looked at Briggs. Then he looked at Maddie. Maddie was walking. She had not stopped. She had not turned around. But her posture had changed, a slight settling, a slight release of something that had been held carefully in place for a long time. "You were attached to the classified recovery unit in," Rourke started. "That is above the clearance level of this formation, sir," she said quietly. The same words she had used on the training field that morning. But they meant something entirely different now. Rourke stood on the canyon road and understood something that required considerable rearranging of what he believed about himself, and about her, and about the morning he had chosen to make a lesson out of someone he had decided was less than him. The thing he had done to her on that field, The contempt, the grab, the public performance of dominance over someone he had assessed as weak, that hadn't been a mistake, made in ignorance about a stranger. He had done it to someone who had been in situations that his training exercises were designed to simulate. Someone who had at some point and in some place kept soldiers alive in the dark with water coming. Someone who might have done it for him, or people like him in a mission he had never seen and would never be cleared to see. He stood with that for several steps. Then he walked faster and said nothing else, and his face was doing something that was harder to look at than his anger had been, because anger in a man like Rourke was familiar and expected, and his face had been designed over 25 years to carry it. What it was doing now was not something his face had had much practice with. It looked in the clear desert air, with the sound of the flood fading behind them, and 14 recovered soldiers moving ahead, something close to shame. Back at the command post, the situation with Calvin Sloan had reached its next stage. Vaughn had the evidence from Tyler's drives. She had the calibration log. She had a legal officer reviewing both in the base JAG office under confidentiality protocol. And she had Sloan's section under quiet observation, which meant that when Sloan moved to the calibration terminal at 0952, apparently deciding that the confusion of the exercise emergency was sufficient cover. There was a sergeant named Watkins standing nearby with a field camera and a very specific set of orders. Sloan made it 6 keystrokes before Watkins said from behind him, "Warrant Officer Sloan, please step away from the terminal." Sloan turned. He looked at Watkins. He looked at the camera. He looked at his own hands on the keyboard, which the camera had already recorded. He made the decision, the wrong decision, the one driven by panic rather than calculation to keep typing. Watkins put her hand on his shoulder. "Sir, step away from the terminal. Now." The 3 keystrokes he managed to complete before he complied were analyzed 4 hours later by the JAG technical team and found to be an incomplete deletion command, the kind that gets far enough to indicate intent, but not far enough to accomplish anything, because the files it was targeting had already been copied 3 times and secured in 3 separate locations by a 22-year-old specialist who had decided 45 minutes earlier to do the right thing. The command post. When Maddie led 14 soldiers through its door at 10:13, was quiet in a way that had texture to it. The particular quiet of a room where something significant has just finished happening. Vaughn was standing at the main table. She looked at the 14 soldiers. She looked at Maddie. She looked briefly at Rourke, who was coming through the door last, and her face conveyed a great deal in a short time, in the way that senior officers' faces do when they have been processing events in parallel with the events themselves. 12 soldiers from Convoy 7, Maddie said. All accounted for. 1 injury, Private Osei right ankle needs medical assessment. Medics are standing by, Ferreira said from the side of the room. Sloan, Maddie said, looking at Vaughn. In custody, Vaughn said. Evidence secured. She paused. Good call on waiting. It was the only call, Maddie said. Vaughn nodded. She looked around the room at the recovered soldiers filing toward the medical station at Tyler Boone, sitting at his terminal with the contained expression of someone who has survived something and is still processing the size of it at Briggs, standing near the door with his arms crossed and his face carrying the particular satisfaction of a man who has watched a thing go the way it should go. Then she looked at Rourke. Rourke had stopped just inside the door. He was looking at the room at Osei being helped toward the medics at the 12 soldiers who were alive and present and accounted for at Maddie's back as she moved to the communications terminal to begin the evidence documentation she had already planned. He was looking at all of it with the face of a man who has had something very basic and very important demonstrated to him in terms he cannot dismiss and cannot explain away. Major Rourke, Vaughn said. Colonel, he said. A pause. We'll debrief in 1 hour. Yes, ma'am. And then he did something that no one in that room had seen Grant Rourke do in recent memory. He moved out of the center of the space, not banished. Vaughn hadn't directed him anywhere. He stepped to the side. He found a chair at the edge of the table, and he sat down in it, and he was quiet, and he watched the room work. Just watched, like a man learning something he should have learned a long time ago. The debrief room had a particular smell that rooms acquire when too many people carrying too much adrenaline spend too long in a confined space. something between burned coffee and the specific tension of people who have things to say and are deciding exactly how to say them. Vaughn sat at the head of the table. Rourke was to her left. Maddie was to her right. Briggs stood near the wall because there were not enough chairs, and he had quietly given his to Martinez, who was still wearing her canyon dust and hadn't eaten since 0500. Tyler Boone sat at the far end of the table with his hands folded in front of him and his face carrying the expression of someone who has accepted that they are about to experience consequences and has made their peace with it. The JAG officer, a precise compact captain named Ellsworth, who had the quality of someone who had heard everything and been surprised by very little, sat beside Tyler with a legal pad and a recorder. Vaughn looked around the table and said without preamble, "Let's be clear about what happened today. Not the version we tell the press liaison. The version we tell each other." Silence. Then Rourke said, "Sloan installed a navigation spoofing program in our digital systems using Specialist Boone's diagnostic device as an access point. The program redirected Training Convoy 7 into the Northeast Canyon Wash during a live exercise. Weather conditions created a flood hazard that became life-threatening when the convoy was unable to exit." He paused. Captain Shaw identified the spoofing, determined the convoy's actual position using historical survey data, and led the recovery team through a secondary route before the flood event reached the canyon floor. He said it cleanly. No hedging, no softening, no version of it that positioned him more favorably. Vaughn looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Maddie. "Anything to add?" Warrant Officer Sloan accessed the terminal at 0952 in an attempt to delete the calibration access records, Maddie said. "The attempt was incomplete. Sergeant Watkins has the documentation. The 3 evidence drives Tyler copied are secured with JAG." She glanced at Tyler. Specialist Boone acted in good faith on what he understood to be a legitimate request from a supervisor. He corrected course as soon as he understood what had occurred and preserved the critical evidence at personal risk. Tyler looked at her. Something crossed his face, the particular expression of someone who has been defended by someone they expected to be their prosecutor, and is still processing the size of that. Ellsworth wrote something on his legal pad. "Sloan's motive," Vaughn said. "I was selling vulnerability demonstrations to a private defense contractor," Maddie said. "He intended to show that military navigation systems could be compromised and corrected within an exercise window proof of concept for the spoofing software. The contractor gets the demonstration data. Sloan gets paid, and the Army's navigation system gets identified as a product deficiency that the contractor's competing product can solve." She paused. "He didn't anticipate the storm. He thought the convoy would be mildly inconvenienced and recovered within the normal exercise parameters. But the storm changed direction," Vaughn said. 60 miles away at 0400 this morning," Maddie said. "By the time the Weather Service registered the front movement, Sloan's program had already been running for 5 hours. He either didn't check the weather update, or he checked it and calculated that the convoy would be recovered before the runoff reached the canyon." She stopped. "He calculated wrong." The room sat with that. 11 years, Rourke said. He wasn't talking to anyone in particular. He was talking at the middle distance at the specific shape of a thing he was trying to understand. 11 years at this base. I've worked alongside that man for 6 of them. Nobody said anything, because there wasn't anything useful to say to that. Vaughn looked at Ellsworth. "What does JAG need to proceed?" "We have sufficient evidence for charges," Ellsworth said. "The calibration log, the diagnostic device record, Tyler's drive copies, and Watkins's documentation of the deletion attempt give us a strong chain. The civilian accomplices, once we have the contractor connection established, will likely be federal jurisdiction, but we can hand that package off." He looked at Maddie. "Captain Shaw, the cross-referencing work you did on the signal frequency, I'll need that in written form for the evidentiary record. I'll have it to you before 1700, she said. Rourke looked at Tyler. "Boone." Tyler straightened. "Sir?" "You connected an unregistered device to the network because your superior told you to, without questioning the protocol violation." Rourke's voice was not kind, but it was not weaponized either. It was the voice of a man saying something that needed to be said accurately. That cost us the opening window in this situation. You understand that? Yes, sir. And you preserved the evidence when it mattered at personal risk, when a warrant officer had just come to your terminal and looked at your screen. He paused. That's the other part. Yes, sir. Rourke looked at Vaughn. The disciplinary action for the protocol violation should be formal, but proportionate. His cooperation and evidence preservation should be part of the record. Vaughn looked at him for a longer moment than was comfortable. In the 23 years she had known Grant Rourke professionally, or known of him, which was a more accurate description of what the Army creates between officers of different commands. She had not heard him advocate for a junior enlisted soldier's proportionate treatment in a disciplinary matter. She had not heard him do much of anything except win the argument. Agreed, she said. Specialist Boone, you'll receive a written counseling statement for the protocol violation. It will be accompanied by a commendation for evidence preservation and operational cooperation. Both go in the record. Tyler let out a breath. It was a small sound, but the room heard it. Dismissed Boone, Vaughn said, not unkindly. Get something to eat. He stood nodded at Maddie with an expression that contained several things he apparently didn't know how to say out loud, and left. The room rearranged itself slightly in his absence. The people remaining were all senior. The thing that needed to happen next was all senior. Vaughn set her hands flat on the table. Major Rourke, the events on the training field this morning. Rourke's jaw set. Yes, ma'am. The unauthorized physical demonstration. The public humiliation of a subordinate officer. Vaughn's voice was even in the way that voices get even when their owner has made a decision and is no longer negotiating with herself about it. This did not happen in isolation. I'm aware of at least 4 prior incidents this year in which your conduct during training exercises crossed the line from demanding into demeaning. I allowed a pattern to continue because your operational results were strong, and I made the calculation that strong results and difficult personalities were a package deal. She paused. I was wrong. Today demonstrated exactly how wrong. Rourke said nothing. His face was the face of a man receiving something accurate. A formal reprimand will be added to your record, Vaughn said. You will complete a mandatory leadership review. During that period, you will remain at Fort Granite under modified operational authority. She looked at him. Is that understood? Yes, ma'am. A pause. Something passed across Vaughn's face. Not softness exactly, but the recognition that the person across from her was not the same person who had called a captain into a demonstration circle that morning. He was the same rank, the same body, the same history. But something had shifted in the architecture of how he was carrying it. You saved a soldier's life today, Major, she said. In the canyon you followed Captain Shaw's lead and you held a support beam for 14 people who needed you to hold it. That is also in the record. She paused. The record is the whole thing, not just the morning. Rourke looked at the table, then at Vaughn. The reprimand is appropriate, Colonel. I know it is, she said. She turned to Maddie. Captain Shaw, the formal question I am required to ask, do you wish to file charges or seek additional disciplinary action against Major Rourke, beyond the reprimand and review I've described? The room which had been quiet became quieter. Maddie looked at Vaughn. She took her time with the answer, not because she was uncertain about it, but because she wanted to say it once and have it be clear. No, she said. Rourke looked at her. He had been not quite looking at her since they came off the canyon road in the careful peripheral way of a man who is aware that direct eye contact requires a kind of honesty he is still assembling. The reprimand is the correct consequence, Maddie said. What I want is not a consequence. What I want is a change. She looked at Vaughn. I want the anonymous reporting system you discussed in the pre-exercise brief. I want the protocol where junior officers and enlisted personnel can flag unsafe conduct in training without it going through their direct chain of command first. I want that operational, not theoretical. Vaughn wrote something. It will be operational within 60 days. I'll sign the authorization today. And the safety plan requirement for any live demonstration involving personnel, Maddie said. Signed before the demonstration, not after. Also approved. Maddie looked at Rourke then. Directly the way she had looked at him on the training field that morning, not as a challenge, but as the basic courtesy of treating him like someone capable of being looked at. "The reprimand is not why I didn't ask for more," she said. "I didn't ask for more because destroying your career doesn't change what happened to those 12 soldiers in that canyon, and it doesn't change the pattern that allowed this morning to happen. You changing does." She paused. "I don't know if you will." Rourke held her gaze. "Neither do I," he said. "That's the first honest thing I've said today." Briggs from his position near the wall shifted his weight. He said nothing, but his face said something, the careful satisfaction of a man watching two people in a room finally occupy the same honest space at the same time. The debrief continued for another 40 minutes. The evidence chain for Sloan's case was organized, the formal reports were assigned. The medical status of the convoy, soldiers, was confirmed. Osei's ankle was a moderate sprain. He would be on light duty for 3 weeks. He had already told the medic he was fine, and the medic had told him she appreciated his opinion and was going to take the x-ray regardless. When the room finally cleared, Maddie stayed at the table. She had a report to write, a formal statement for JAG, and the signal frequency cross-reference documentation that Ellsworth needed. She had also not eaten since 0500, which she was aware of in the distant, filed-away way of someone who has learned to postpone that category of awareness when other things are happening. Rourke came back through the door. She looked up. Howe was carrying 2 cups of coffee. He set one on her side of the table and kept one in his hand and stood there with it, and the specific awkwardness of a physically large man who is uncertain what to do with his hands was in its way more revealing than anything he had said in the debrief. "I owe you something," he said. "You don't owe me coffee," she said. She picked up the cup. "I owe you something that coffee doesn't cover," he said. "But coffee is what I can do in the next 3 minutes, so." She looked at him. Howe was standing on the other side of the table, not moving, not performing, not organizing his face into any of the expressions she had seen him deploy all morning. He just looked tired. The specific tiredness of a man whose self-image has had a significant structural revision and has not yet adapted to the new weight distribution. "Sit down, Major," she said. He sat. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The command post was quiet around them. The organized post-crisis quiet of a space where people have gone to process or sleep or eat, where the radios are still running, but at a lower urgency, where the clock on the wall moves at a speed that feels almost normal again. "I read your transfer record," Rourke said. "When you arrived, 6 weeks ago." "I know," she said. "Everyone reads the transfer record. It listed your positions. Intelligence analysis, signals assessment. 2 deployments, both listed as support roles." "Yes." "It said nothing about a classified recovery unit," he said. "It wouldn't," she said. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "I made a decision about who you were based on a document that was specifically designed to not tell me who you were." She looked at him. "You made a decision about who I was based on the fact that I was quiet, and I had a notepad, and I didn't perform competence in the way you recognized." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "That's more accurate." "Lots of people do that," she said. "You're not the worst version of it I've encountered." He looked at her. "That's not reassuring." "It's not meant to be," she said. "It's meant to be true." He sat with that. Outside the command post, they could hear the base returning to its regular functions, the vehicles moving, the voices of soldiers going about the afternoon, the distant sound of the training field being reconfigured for whatever came next. The ordinary machinery of a military installation which does not pause for the extraordinary things that happen inside it. "Briggs said you were with the recovery unit in the mountain region," Rourke said. "The coordinated ambush case, the one where the radio traffic was manipulated." She looked at her coffee cup. "That was the one," he said quietly. "Wasn't it?" She didn't confirm it. She didn't need to. The confirmation was in what she didn't say, in the quality of her stillness, in the specific way she held herself when the subject arrived. Not uncomfortable, not afraid, but with the careful containment of someone who has carried a thing for a long time and knows exactly what shape it is in the dark. Rourke put his cup down. He looked at his hands. He looked at the table. He was assembling something, not an excuse. She could see that, but an understanding, the kind that costs something because it requires dismantling something else to get there. "You kept my patrol alive," he said. It was almost too quiet to hear. "In a situation I never knew was more than bad luck and good timing. And I brought you in front of 300 soldiers and called your career desk work." The silence between them was not comfortable, but it was honest, which was better. "You didn't know," she said. "That's the point. You should have treated me with basic professional respect without knowing." She looked at him directly. "The classified history is not the reason I deserved it. I deserved it because I was a commissioned officer in your battalion who had done nothing to earn contempt." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're right," he said. "And I'm going to have to live with the fact that I needed to find out the hard way." "Most people do," she said. "The ones who bother to find out at all are ahead of most." It was not forgiveness. She wasn't offering forgiveness, and he wasn't asking for it. He was too honest a man, or was becoming one, to ask for something that was not yet earned. But it was a door, a small one requiring further work to open, the kind that exists because someone decided it was worth building. Rourke stood. He picked up his cup. "The formal apology," he said. "I want to do it in front of the same formation." She looked up at him. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to," he said. "That's why I want to." She studied him. The man who had stood on the training field that morning with 300 soldiers as his audience, and used every one of them as a tool to make her small, was now proposing to use the same audience in the opposite direction. She looked for performance in it, for the version of this that was still about him, about the drama of the redemption arc, about how it would look. She looked carefully. She didn't find it. What she found was a man who was frightened of a different thing now than he had been frightened of that morning, and who was trying to move toward it anyway. "The formation is your decision to make," she said. "If you make it, mean it." "I'll mean it," he said. He moved toward the door. Then he stopped. "Shaw." "Rourke, the thing you said on the field. The question is whether you can face what you've become." He looked at her. "How long had you known that that was what I'd become?" She considered the question seriously, the way it deserved. "Since about the third day," she said, "when I watched you dress down a corporal in front of his entire squad for a reporting error that was one line wrong in a 40-page document." He absorbed this. "And you said nothing." "It wasn't my authority to say anything," she said. "I was new. I put it in my assessment and forwarded it through the correct channels." She paused. "No one acted on it." Vaughn had been in the doorway for the last 30 seconds. Neither of them had heard her arrive, which said something about where their attention was, and she stepped fully into the room now, because the moment had passed, the point where remaining outside it was appropriate. "I saw the assessment," Vaughn said. Rourke turned. Vaughn's face had the quality of a confession, which it was. 3 weeks ago, I flagged it for follow-up and moved it to the end of the week's action items." She looked at Rourke. "And then the end of the week came, and there was an operational priority, and I moved it again." She looked at Maddie. "I owe you an apology too, Captain. The system failed you before this morning did." Maddie looked at her. "Yes, ma'am. It did. The council I'm establishing," Vaughn said. "Junior soldiers cross-rank. Independent oversight of training conduct." She said it directly. "That came from your assessment. All of it. It just came 3 weeks too late." "It's here now," Maddie said. Vaughn nodded. She set something on the table, a single sheet of paper, the authorization form for the anonymous reporting system, already signed, dated today, effective immediately. Maddie looked at it. She looked at Vaughn. "Thank you, Colonel," she said. The afternoon moved forward. The evidentiary work consumed 3 hours. Maddie's signal analysis documentation, Ellsworth's chain of custody filings, the formal statements from DeLuca and Martinez, and the other convoy soldiers. All of it organized with the thoroughness that prosecuting a warrant officer with 11 years of service required. Sloan had said nothing since his initial interview, which Ellsworth had advised everyone to treat as expected. The contractor connection surfaced at 14:30, when Ellsworth's counterpart at federal level ran the payment records Tyler's log had partially captured. The contractor, a defense technology company, with 3 active contracts and a pending navigation systems bid. With the Army had paid Sloan $78,000 across 14 months through a consulting arrangement set up under a name that was not Sloan's, but was connected to a mailing address that was. Ellsworth read the report summary to Vaughn over the phone, and when he finished, there was a long pause, and then Vaughn said, "He sold a live training exercise with real soldiers for $78,000. "Yes, ma'am." "Make sure that number is in the formal charge document," she said. "Specifically." "Yes, ma'am." At 15:15. Maddie finished the last section of her signal analysis report and sent it to Ellsworth's terminal. She leaned back in the chair and looked at the ceiling of the command post and was, for the first time since 0700 that morning, not actively solving anything. Briggs appeared beside her with a field ration pack and a bottle of water, which he set on the desk without commentary. She looked at it, then at him. "How long have you known?" He sat down across from her. "Pieces of it for a couple of hours, the full picture since the Canyon Road." "The recovery unit." "The technique was the same," he said. "Drainage line cross-reference. I only saw it done once by one person in one situation, and it worked then exactly the way it worked today." She opened the ration pack. "You should know that engagement is still classified." "I'm aware," he said. "I didn't use the name. I didn't give a location. I said enough to make him understand." She looked at him. "Why?" Briggs leaned forward, his forearms on the table. He was a large man with a careful face, and his face right now was carrying something that had been in there for a while. "Because Grant Rourke is not a bad officer," he said. "He is a man who went through something years ago that broke something in him and rebuilt it wrong, and nobody in his chain of command had the courage or the standing to say so, and he turned into something worse than he needed to be." He paused. "And because you walked out of that canyon without a word about what you'd done before, the same way you walked out of the engagement all those years ago, and I thought he needed to know what he was actually dealing with." "He should have treated me correctly without knowing," she said. "Yes," Briggs said. "He should have, and he didn't. And now he knows, and maybe that's the version of this where something changes instead of nothing changing." He looked at her. "I'm not saying it was fair. I'm saying I thought it was useful." She ate half the ration in silence. Then, "He was one of yours back then." Briggs was quiet for a moment. "He was a lieutenant. The ambush would have taken half the patrol if the radio traffic hadn't been flagged in time." He looked at the table. "He never knew how close it was." She looked at the field ration wrapper in her hand. "No," she said. "They rarely do." The room around them was quiet and warm, and the afternoon light was at the angle that makes any room feel like it's at the far end of a long day, and outside the base was moving back toward normal, and somewhere in the base, Rourke was sitting with whatever he was sitting with, and Tyler Boone was eating a real meal for the first time since the previous night, and 12 soldiers from Training Convoy 7 were beginning to tell the story of what happened to them in the canyon to the people who had not been there. The story getting slightly larger with each telling in the way that stories do when the terror has faded enough to be safe to describe. Private Osei, sitting in the medical bay with his ankle wrapped and elevated, told the medic who was finishing his chart that the captain who led the recovery team was the quietest person he had ever been glad to see in his life. The medic, who had been at Fort Granite for 2 years and had heard a great deal about the events of the day, looked up from the chart and said, "What was she like?" Osei thought about it. "Like someone who already knew how it was going to end," he said, "and was just moving toward it." The medic wrote something in the chart. Outside the window, the desert evening was beginning, the sky moving from its hard afternoon blue toward something deeper, and the day that had started with a man shouting at a woman to face him was settling into its full weight. The lives saved, the damage done. The accountability levied, the understanding paid for in the particular currency of people who had to be endangered before the right lessons were learned. Maddie finished the field ration. She drank the water. She looked at the signed authorization form still sitting on the table, Vaughn's signature clean and final at the bottom. She folded it carefully and put it in her jacket pocket. Not because she needed to carry it, but because some things needed to exist somewhere other than on a table in a room where they might be overlooked at the end of the week. She understood about things that got overlooked at the end of the week. She was not going to let this one be one of them. The formation order went out at 0700 the following morning, and by the time it reached the junior enlisted barracks, 3 separate versions of it had already spread through the battalion by word of mouth. Each version slightly different in its details, but identical in its essential strangeness. Major Rourke had requested a full battalion formation on the main training field. Same field as yesterday. Same time. No exercise scenario attached. No one knew what to do with that. The soldiers who had been on the field the previous morning, all 300 of them, came out to the formation with the particular alertness of people who have learned that something unexpected can happen in a place they thought they understood. They stood in their positions, and they waited, and they talked among themselves in the way soldiers talk when they are trying to figure out what the situation requires of them before the situation announces itself. Sergeant Martinez was in the 3rd rank with DeLuca 2 positions to her left. She had slept 4 hours. She had eaten breakfast. Her uniform was correct, and her face was the face of someone who had been in a canyon the previous afternoon and was still metabolizing the fact of it. "You think he's going to do it?" DeLuca said without moving his eyes from the front of the formation. "I think he said he was going to do it," Martinez said. "And whatever else Rourke is, he does what he says he's going to do. That's not always a good quality." "Today I think it might be," she said. Private Osei was in the rear rank on crutches because the medic had insisted, and Osei had accepted the insistence with better grace than expected, possibly because he was still operating on the residual gratitude of a man who had listened to a flood, eat 3 military vehicles from 20 feet away, and walked out of the situation with a sprained ankle and a story. Tyler Boone was in this communications section cluster, standing straight and very still in the way of someone who is aware that he is in a position he almost wasn't in. The commendation had been added to his file at 1700 the previous day. He had read it twice. It had used the words initiative integrity, under pressure, and operational contribution. He had read those words and sat with them, and then gone to eat dinner alone in the back of the mess hall and looked at his food for 5 minutes before he started eating. I was still processing what it meant that the person who had saved him from the worst version of this outcome was the same person who could have made him the most convenient explanation for everything that went wrong. Warrant Officer Sloan was not in the formation. Warrant Officer Sloan was in the Provost Marshal's office where he had spent the night, and where he would continue to spend his foreseeable future, while the federal jurisdiction question was sorted out, and the defense contractor's legal team finished reading the documents that had been served to them at 0600. Colonel Vaughn stood to the side of the field, not in the formation, not at the podium. She was standing where an observer stands, and her posture was the posture of someone who has decided to witness something rather than manage it. Maddie was near the intelligence section. She was wearing her uniform correctly, standing at ease with her hands clasped behind her back, and she was watching the front of the field with an expression that revealed very little. The soldiers near her had been stealing glances at her since they arrived, the particular sideways attention that people give to someone they have decided to recalibrate their understanding of. The young corporal who had shouted field experience the previous morning was 3 positions to her left. He had been unable to look directly at her since 0650. He was working on it. Rourke came onto the field at 0758. 2 minutes early, which was unlike him. He typically arrived at exactly the assigned time. The theatrical precision of a man who understood that timing is its own form of authority. The 2 minutes early meant something. The soldiers felt it without being able to name it. He walked to the center of the field, not to the podium. The podium was there. It had been set up by the duty sergeant out of habit, but Rourke walked past it and stood in the open space where he had stood the previous morning, where he had called Maddie into the demonstration circle, where the thing that needed to be answered today had first been said. He stood without props, without notes, without the physical arrangement of authority that he had spent 25 years perfecting. 300 soldiers looked at him. He looked back at them for a moment. Just looked, which was not something he typically did. He typically did things to crowds rather than with them. This was different. This was a man arriving at something and taking a second to understand that he had arrived. "Yesterday morning," he said, "I assembled this battalion on this field, and I called Captain Madeline Shaw into the center of it. I questioned her career. I questioned her courage. I questioned her value as an officer. He stopped. Not for effect, because the next sentence required a different kind of breath. And then I grabbed her wrist during an unauthorized demonstration that had no safety plan and no legitimate training purpose. The field was completely silent. Not the waiting silence of the previous morning, not the charged silence of a crowd anticipating entertainment. This was something quieter and more serious. The silence of 300 people understanding that what they were hearing was real. None of that was leadership, Rourke said. It was rank being used as a weapon against someone I had decided was beneath me. And I had made that decision based on nothing more than the fact that she was quiet, and she had a notepad, and she didn't perform her competence in the way I was used to seeing it performed. A soldier in the fourth rank exhaled. It was barely audible. But in that silence, it was enough to register, and it was the sound of someone releasing a breath they had been holding because they recognized in his description something they had seen done to someone they knew, or something done to them, or something they had watched and stayed silent about. Rourke's voice didn't waver. He was holding himself to an accounting that was costing something real, and the cost was visible, and the visibility was the point. What I did not know, he said, and what I should not have needed to know in order to treat a fellow officer with basic respect, was that Captain Shaw has a service record that I am not cleared to describe in full. What I can tell you within the limits of what is authorized is this: the technique she used to recover Convoy 7 from Red Mesa Canyon yesterday. Identifying a secondary terrain route using historical survey data and drainage pattern analysis is a technique developed and used by a classified recovery unit. A technique that has in at least one documented instance been used to prevent significant casualties in a coordinated ambush scenario. He stopped. An instance involving soldiers from this battalion. The silence changed register. In the intelligence section cluster, Maddie's hands were still clasped behind her back. She had not moved, but something in her face had shifted. Not surprised she had known this was coming since Rourke told her what he intended, but the specific involuntary response of someone hearing themselves described accurately in public by someone who had no obligation to do so and is doing it anyway. DeLuca in the third rank turned his head very slightly toward Martinez. Martinez did not turn back. She was staring at the front of the field with the expression of someone doing math. I mocked her for working in what I called a map room, Rourke said. What I did not understand, what I refused to consider, was that her stillness was not absence. It was presence of a kind I had stopped being able to recognize because I had spent years convincing myself that the only valid form of strength was the one that looked like mine. He turned his head. Across the field he found Maddie. 300 soldiers tracked the direction of his look. She looked back at him. She did not look away. Captain Shaw, he said. He did not shout it. He said it at a volume calibrated to be heard by everyone, which was different from performance. What I did to you on this field yesterday was wrong. It was wrong before I knew your history. It was wrong before the canyon. It was wrong from the first word. He paused. I am sorry, publicly, formally, and without conditions. The field held its breath. What 300 soldiers were watching for, what they could not help watching for, was Maddie's reaction. Because this was the moment in the story, they recognized the moment where the person who has been wronged either accepts the apology and the narrative completes itself in the satisfying way, or refuses it, and the thing stays broken, or does something else entirely. The third option that real life sometimes produces, and fiction rarely earns. Maddie unclenched her hands from behind her back. She stepped forward, not far, just enough to indicate that she was stepping toward the moment rather than away from it. Major Rourke, she said. Her voice was steady and clear, and carried in the morning air with the quality of something that has been considered before being said. Your apology is heard. She stopped there for a moment. Let it be what it was. Then she looked at the formation, not at Rourke, but at the 300 soldiers assembled on the field, and she said the thing she had been thinking since the canyon road, since the debrief table, since the moment she sat in the command post with a signed authorization form in her pocket, and understood that consequences without change were just another form of punishment. I want to say something to this formation, she said. Not about yesterday, about what yesterday means. No one moved. There are people in this battalion, she said, who have skills that look nothing like what you expect skills to look like. People who are quiet in briefings and thorough in their reports and careful in their recommendations. People who get called overthinking when they are actually preventing the failure that everyone else will have to manage later. She let that settle. Those people are not obstacles to the mission. In most cases, they are the reason the mission survives contact with reality. A corporal in the front rank, not the one who had shouted the previous morning. A different one felt something move through his chest that he could not have named precisely, but that had something to do with recognition. The specific recognition of someone who has been described accurately by someone who did not know they were describing them. The other thing I want to say, Maddie continued, is this: underestimated people should not have to produce extraordinary credentials to receive ordinary respect. You should not have to save a life before someone believes you can save a life. You should not have to absorb public humiliation before you are permitted to demonstrate competence. She looked across the formation. The system that allows a senior officer to grab a junior officer's wrist in front of 300 soldiers without a plan, without authorization, and without consequence, that system is broken. And the only people who can fix a broken system are the ones who are willing to say that it is broken and mean it enough to change it. She looked at Vaughn briefly. Vaughn's face did not move, but her eyes said something. Colonel Vaughn has established an anonymous reporting protocol for training conduct effective as of yesterday, Maddie said, and a cross-rank leadership council with the authority to flag unsafe practices without going through the direct chain of command. Those things exist now. They did not exist this time yesterday. She paused. That is what accountability looks like when it goes somewhere. Not punishment alone. Change. She looked back at Rourke. I don't know what Major Rourke becomes from here, she said. I don't know that about anyone. I know what he did today, and it cost him something, and he did it anyway. That matters. She paused. It is not the end of the accounting, but it is the beginning of something better than just the damage. Rourke stood at the front of the formation, and his face was the face of a man who has been given something he had not expected and is not entirely sure what to do with the weight of it. Not absolution. Not the clean closure of a story that resolves itself completely. Something more difficult and more durable, the responsibility of having been seen clearly by someone with every reason to see him badly and treated with more fairness than he had earned. He straightened, not the performative straightening of a man who has claimed the room. The actual straightening of a person deciding to carry something correctly. The formation was dismissed. The 300 soldiers broke from their positions in the way soldiers do, organized, efficient, with the undercurrent of the thing they had just witnessed moving through every conversation that started in the next 30 seconds. The story was already growing, already being told, already moving through the battalion in the specific way that moments do when they land on something true. DeLuca caught up with Maddie at the edge of the field. He was not a man given to extended expression. His whole operational style was built around concision. But he stopped her with a word and looked at her with the direct, uncomplicated gratitude of someone who had been in the canyon. "Ma'am," he said. "Thank you." "You stopped the vehicles," she said. "You moved your people to high ground. You made every right call in a situation where nobody was giving you the information you needed." "I had training," he said. "So did I," she said. "That's the point." He nodded. He moved on. Martinez caught up to him, and they walked together, and Martinez said, "Did you know about any of that, the classified unit?" "No," DeLuca said. "Does it change anything about yesterday?" He thought about it. "It changes what I know about her," he said. "It doesn't change what he did." He paused. "Those are two different things." Martinez was quiet for a moment. "That's exactly what she said." "Then she's right twice," he said. Tyler Boone reached Maddie before she left the field. He had been moving toward her since the formation broke, threading through the dispersing crowd with the focused urgency of someone who has something specific to say and is concerned about losing the nerve before he gets there. "Captain Shaw," he said. She turned. She looked at him. "I wanted to—" He stopped, started again. "What you said to the formation, about people who are quiet in briefings and thorough in their reports." He stopped again. He was not a man who had spent a lot of time practicing how to say things like this, and it showed, which was also the thing that made it credible. I'm going to be better at the protocol stuff. Not because I'm afraid of consequences. Because I understand now what the protocol is actually for. She looked at him for a moment. That's the right reason, she said. I know I made it harder yesterday, he said. Even if I didn't mean to. You made it harder, and you fixed it, she said. Most people only get to do one of those things. You did both. She paused. Don't waste it, he nodded. He turned and walked away, and the set of his shoulders was slightly different from the set they'd had when he arrived on the field, and whether that was resolve or relief or both, was something that only time and a lot of unglamorous routine decisions would confirm. Briggs found Maddie, where she always ended up when a situation resolved, at a table with paperwork doing the documentation that the operational moments required and almost never received. He sat across from her, and for a moment he said nothing because they were past the point where filling silence was necessary. Where do you go from here? He said finally. She looked up. I stay, she said. Through the end of the evaluation period. I run the decentralized navigation assessment for the base curriculum. I finish what I started. And then? Then wherever the next assignment sends me, she said. She looked at him. Why? He looked at the table. Because I've watched you work for 2 days in conditions that would have broken officers twice your age, and I want to make sure someone in this building is paying attention to what that means for your career. Colonel Vaughn is paying attention, she said. Good, he said. Someone should have been paying attention 6 weeks ago. She looked at him with the careful, measuring expression she brought to most things. Briggs, you've been responsible for a lot of what went right in the last 24 hours. Not just the canyon, the way you positioned information, the way you managed the space between Rourke and the mission without letting either of them destroy the other. That's called being a master sergeant, he said. No, she said. That's called being exceptional at it. She held his gaze. I'm going to put that in writing too. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said with the quiet specificity of someone who means something exactly as large as the words they choose, It's been an honor, Captain. She nodded. Get some sleep, Noah. He stood. He almost said something else. Then he decided against it and walked away, and she watched him go with the expression of someone who has spent long enough in the field to know the difference between the people you work with and the people you are genuinely glad to have been in the same impossible situation alongside. They were different categories. Briggs was the second kind. The weeks that followed moved at the pace that institutional change moves when someone is pushing it from inside faster than history, but slower than urgency, which is both the frustration and the reality of it. The anonymous reporting system went live on the 3rd day. The first report came in on the 5th day. It described a training conduct issue in a different section, unrelated to Rourke, that had been occurring for 14 months without formal record. Vaughn acted on it within 48 hours. Word spread. The kind of word that spreads when people discover that a thing they thought was theoretical is operational. Rourke's leadership review began the 2nd week. The officer conducting it was a colonel from a neighboring installation selected for independence, who had read the reprimand documentation and the debrief transcripts and the training field witness accounts, and had arrived with the particular expression of someone prepared to be rigorous. What she found over the following 3 weeks surprised her in the specific way that complicated people often surprise the reviewers who expect them to be simpler than they are. Rourke was not a man who had broken entirely and needed to be rebuilt from nothing. He was a man who had lost the thread of something he had once understood: the distinction between demanding excellence and punishing imperfection, between holding people to a high standard and making them afraid to fail in front of him. He had known that distinction once early in his career when he had been the lieutenant in the patrol before something happened to him that he had handled in the way that certain men handle things that are too large for the tools they have alone, and incorrectly, and in a way that left a mark shaped like the thing he had lost. The review documented all of it. The reviewing officer submitted her findings with a recommendation that Rourke remain at Fort Granite under continued mentorship with modified operational authority and quarterly evaluation. She noted in the final paragraph that the accountability process itself Specifically, the public nature of Rourke's acknowledgement and Maddie's response had produced measurable shifts in the battalion's internal reporting culture within the first 2 weeks. She noted that this was not common. That most leadership failures produced consequences, or they produced change, but rarely both at the same time, and that the case at Fort Granite was unusual in having produced both simultaneously, because the people involved had made decisions that prioritized the harder right over the easier wrong. She did not use anyone's name in that paragraph. She didn't need to. Calvin Sloan was formally charged in the 3rd week. The federal counts were filed alongside the military charges, and the defense contractor, whose legal team had spent 2 weeks trying to construct a plausible distance between themselves and the consulting arrangement, eventually ran out of room to construct it in, because Tyler Boone's diagnostic log was thorough in the way that only a young specialist following instructions he believed were legitimate could make it complete, time-stamped, and entirely without gaps. The contractor's navigation systems bid with the Army was withdrawn. Sloan accepted a plea arrangement in the 6th week. 11 years of service ended at a table with lawyers on both sides and a digital record that left no version of events in which he was the reasonable actor in the story. On the day the plea was entered, Tyler Boone was running communication support for a training exercise in the Eastern Canyon. He was using a paper map and a compass and a timed movement schedule, because the decentralized navigation protocol was now part of the standard training rotation, and he was better at it than anyone in his section had expected, because it turned out that a person who has spent significant time understanding how digital systems fail develops an unusually good instincts for the analog alternatives. His sergeant told him afterward that his land navigation was the best in the group. He said he'd had good instruction. Months passed. The training field at Fort Granite was used for dozens of exercises, and in each of them there was the ghost of what had happened on the morning of Operation Broken Compass, not as drama, not as story, but as institutional memory, the kind that changes what people do before they have to think about why. Rourke addressed every new arriving class. He told them about the morning he ordered a quiet captain to face him. He told them what he had believed about her and why he had believed it, and how completely and specifically and verifiably wrong he had been. He told them about the canyon. He told them about the mining road and the drainage line and the 12 soldiers who came home because someone was willing to read an old paper map and trust what it said. He did not make himself the hero of the story. He did not arrange the telling so that his eventual behavior in the canyon rehabilitated his conduct on the field. He held both things at once, the wrongness of the morning and the correctness of the afternoon, and told the arriving soldiers that a person could do both in a single day, and that the point was not which one you were, but which one you kept choosing. It was the most honest speech Grant Rourke had ever given, and he gave it so many times that it stopped being a speech and became something closer to a practice. The practice of saying a hard, true thing until it was no longer hard, because it was no longer untrue about who he was. 1 year after Operation Broken Compass, Fort Granite scheduled an evaluation exercise. The battalion was assembled. The decentralized navigation protocol was the core of the scenario. The observer team was external, independent, and thorough. Maddie arrived on the first day of the evaluation. She came through the base gate in a vehicle that was neither announced nor significant, and the first soldiers who recognized her were 2 specialists from the communications section who had been on the training field a year ago, who looked at each other for a moment before they realized they were doing what people do when they see someone they associate with something important. They stood straighter without deciding to. The word moved through the battalion, the way words move when a place has a memory and the memory has a face. By the time Maddie reached the command post to review the evaluation protocol with Vaughn, there were people in doorways who weren't pretending to do anything except look. Vaughn met her at the command post door. They shook hands. Vaughn's grip was firm and brief, and said several things without saying any of them. "How does it look?" Maddie said, meaning the battalion. "Better," Vaughn said. "Measurably." "Briggs. Still the best master sergeant on the installation," Vaughn said. "He'd say you told him to get more sleep and it worked if you asked him." Maddie almost smiled. "And Rourke?" Vaughn was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that precedes accuracy rather than avoidance. "He's different," she said. "Not finished, but different. He asked me last week whether he could formally nominate the decentralized navigation protocol for adoption at the training command level. Maddie looked at her. "What did you say?" "I said yes," Vaughn said. "And I said the nomination should include your name as originator." He agreed. "He said it was the only way it made sense," Vaughn said. She held Maddie's gaze. "He also said something else. He said she was right that I should have respected her before I knew. But I want her to know that knowing changes how I understand what I wasted." Vaughn paused. "I told him to tell you himself. I did." Later that afternoon, in the same command post, standing in the same general configuration as many other conversations that had happened in that room over the past year, Rourke told her directly and without preamble, which was the only way he had been able to tell people true things since the canyon. She listened. She did not tell him it was fine, because it hadn't been fine, and she respected him enough now to not offer him that exit. She told him she heard him. She told him the work he had done in the year mattered. She told him that change was not the same as erasure, and that she did not need the morning to unhappen, she needed what came after it to be real. He said it was real. She looked at him with the direct, calibrated attention she brought to all things and said, "I know." On the main training field. The following morning, the evaluation exercise began. The battalion assembled in full. And when Maddie walked onto the field to run the opening assessment protocol, the formation did something that had not been planned, had not been ordered, had not been suggested by any officer or NCO. 300 soldiers turned toward her as she reached the center of the field, and they saluted. Not at a command. Not in sequence. Together. The simultaneous voluntary decision of 300 people who had arrived over the course of 1 year's worth of ordinary and extraordinary days at the same understanding. Maddie stopped. She looked at the formation. For one moment, just one, her face was exactly what it was, which was the face of someone who had spent years being unseen, choosing to remain visible, who had carried classified histories in unmarked files, and eaten field rations alone, and fixed problems in rooms where no one would ever know her name, who had stood in front of 300 soldiers and been told she was less, and had said plainly, and without cruelty, that she was not. She raised her hand and returned the salute. Then she said, "At ease. Let's get to work." And they did. Because the work was the point. The work had always been the point. The recognition was real, and it mattered, and it was not the destination. It was simply what happened when you did the work long enough and well enough and honestly enough that the people around you finally understood what they had been standing next to all along. Some people need a dramatic revelation before they extend ordinary dignity. That is a failure of imagination, and sometimes of courage, and sometimes simply of attention. Maddie Shaw never needed anyone to see her extraordinary history to deserve their respect. She needed them to open their eyes. And in the end, 300 soldiers did exactly that, not because they were ordered to, not because they were shamed into it, not because a story required it, but because they had watched what quiet competence looked like when it was tested in the hardest possible conditions, and they had recognized something true. Real strength does not announce itself. It shows up in the dark, reads the map, finds the route, and brings everyone home. And when the morning comes, it does not ask to be thanked. It only asks that you pay attention.